Thank you, welcome. So I want to spend the next 30 minutes showing you pictures of brains and seeing how much you can tolerate. There's going to be only two that are this extreme. What I want to talk to you today is the topic that I've spent the last decade looking into, and that is the 3 pounds between our ears. And essentially, I want to share with you where neuroscience is standing right now, and what is the thing that excites me and many of my colleagues that maybe will be the thing that we're going to deal with in the last 3 years and in the next 10 years. So the kind of 15 years of neuroscience starting 2 years ago and going into 2029. So one of the interesting things about the brain is if you look at it from a microscope, it looks the same from any perspective. Any part of the brain looks the same, the part in the back, the part in the front. You can't really tell where you are in the brain. And more interesting, if you look at the brain of other animals, many animals at the level of the brain look the same. But somehow everything is different about us. And when you talk about that in the context of evolution, you basically see that evolution changed a lot of the outside, but on the inside, we have a lot of similarities that make us different on behavioral, but still doesn't change the mechanics. And one of the interesting things that come to life when you look at diagrams of evolution like this one is that the time scales are really, really long. Everything is in millions of years. It took us millions of years to go from our closest ancestor, the apes, to the crown of creation, humans. And what's amazing about humans is how similar they are to what happened before, and yet how different we are in what we can and cannot do. And the thing that neuroscientists are really excited about in the last 2 years and going forward is a project that basically tries to ask the question, how different can we be from our ancestors, and how much can we change what comes next after us? Because as you probably know, you look pretty much the same as your parents, and your kids look pretty much like you, and if we don't do anything, things are going to kind of be the same. We're going to just look the way we looked for many, many centuries before. But now, the title of a project that excites a lot of neuroscientists is Human Version 2.0. What can we do to really play with evolution and take over and change everything, starting from the brain and how it interacts with nature? So here's what I mean by that. I flew here yesterday from Cannes using an airplane, and the plane was canceled. The flight was canceled, so I had to take a different one. Now, in theory, they say you have a choice, and we thank you for making a choice to choose to work with us or not with other company, but the reality is that I didn't really have a lot of choices. The only option for me to come here was essentially choose one of a number of airlines. I couldn't really just say, okay, if the airlines don't work, I'm going to just fly here with my own wings. And the reason we don't have wings, partially, is because they don't really prove any advantage to us right now. So if evolution actually were to make wings for us, it would take millions of years. Probably none of the people in the room would actually get to see that. It would start with a little bump in the shoulder that somehow has an advantage, that actually using mutations kind of become better and better and takes over until we get wings. That's going to take a lot of time. But actually, if we wanted to have wings that we build, we know how to do that. We know how to build wings mechanically. We build airplanes that use them. And we know how to attach them to the body. Plastic surgeons know how to connect things to the body to some extent. But somehow, we don't know how to put wings in humans. And that is because we're missing the one part that is the critical part, which is how do we plug them to the brain? Well, it turns out, we now are beginning to understand the language of the brain. And what we learn is that once we plug things into the brain learns to control them. And when it does, it feels like it's part of our body. So think about getting a heart transplant. If someone has a heart attack and they actually have their heart replaced with the heart of someone else, it's someone else's heart. Once we put it in our body and we close everything and wake you up, the brain immediately learns how to control that, and it feels like it's part of us. You don't say there's me and there's a body, a heart that's pumping inside of me. It just feels like it's part of you. In the same way, the understanding that we have right now is that once you plug stuff into the body and connect it to the brain, it would immediately feel like it's part of you. So those wings that we can build, if we plug them into the brain, and the brain learns how to control them, they're going to actually feel naturally as if they're part of our body. Now, plugging things to the brain isn't easy. We have to speak the language of the brain. But turns out, in the last 100 years, we actually are beginning to understand the code of the brain, the language. And what we learn is that the brain actually has a pretty clear way it speaks. It speaks in some kind of code that's electrochemical that we can interpret in sound. So if you were to zoom into the brain and look at any of the neurons there, any of the cells, and listen to them speak, what you would hear is something that sounds like a tick. And these ticks of activity, this burst of activity, is the language of the brain. So if we take the wings and we find a way to actually make them speak when they flap the language of the brain and plug them, we assume that somehow the brain will do the other part, which is learn how to control them. And it's not magic anymore. For the last 2 years, scientists have been playing with this idea. So what we do first is we do it in the very crude way of opening a brain and actually plugging devices straight to it. That's the next time I'm going to show you a picture of the brain, so get ready if you don't like pictures. The idea is we have surgeons open the brain and put sheets of electrodes on the surface of the head and actually just have the electrodes speak the language of the brain. And what we see time and again is that when we do that, the brain learns how to interact with them. As long as we speak the language, the brain adapts and starts to operate devices on the outside world. So this field of brain-computer interfaces allows us to essentially plug a device to the brain and make sure that the device speaks the language of the brain and have the brain learn in itself how to control this device. Now, this is kind of magical, but it actually is not surprising. We know that in a way, this is how the brain works. This is how the brain learns things since we were born. So if you take a baby that's about 4 months old, it doesn't really have language, or it doesn't really have anything that it knows really about the world, but it just uses very simple mechanics of the brain to learn things about itself. So it bubbles and makes noises, and it hears the noises coming out, and it learns quickly what things come out of its own mouth, and the brain basically adapts quickly. And over the first few months of each and every one's lives, we actually learned how to see. We turned shapes and colors or rotations into vision. We learn how to figure out what frequencies are the ones that people actually speak in, and we learn how to do that. We learn how to look in the right direction. So over the course of the very first months of your life, the brain does exactly that. It just is bombarded with information, and it quickly learns how to find patterns in this information and see what is reality and what is not. So our brain is really good in doing just that, finding meaning in patterns, figuring out what works and what doesn't work, and knowing how to connect to devices in the outside world. First, it's our eyes, our ears, and our nose, and then gradually it could be anything else. And once we know how to do that, we can actually start connecting the world to the brain and do things. So here's an example of something we did recently. In a very crude way, we plugged the brain of a guy using a very simple machine, something that just reads the brain's activity from the outside. And we just try to read whether he wants to go left or right with his brain. And when he does that, he gets to control a robotic arm that allows him to play drums with a third arm. And again, that's very simple. This is something we can do with any person in the room. We just learn how you think when you think some basic thoughts, and we control those machines using those thoughts. That's a very simple thing. And that's because we're on the outside. But if you go inside with the electrodes, you can do a lot more fancy stuff. So maybe one of the hallmarks of research is one done 10 years ago now by a guy in Pittsburgh that basically took monkeys, opened their brains, and put electrodes inside their head. So now you can actually get a very high reading of the brain. And the monkey's arms are tied, so it can't really move their arm. And then when you put a marshmallow in front of the eyes and it tries to reach with its own arm, the brain thinks, I want to reach. The arms are tied, so it can't do it, but instead a robotic arm reads the brain activity and gives him the marshmallow. Now this experiment was so famous in the news that many of you probably know about it, but there's something here that isn't famous, and that I think is the most interesting thing that's going to take me forward. Because this experiment had the monkey sit there for about 7 hours, there was marshmallow in front of it, he tried to get to it, he couldn't get it, he thought about getting it, the robotic arm read the activity, reached for the marshmallow, and fed the monkey. This is not surprising. What's surprising is what happened afterwards. So the experiment is over, the monkey's arms are untied, and now he can actually use his own biological arm to reach for the marshmallow and eat it regularly. But somehow, in course of those few days, actually, not hours, where the monkey's arms were tied, it somehow unlearned how to control his own biological arm with his brain. And when you untie the arm, it still thinks about reaching the marshmallow and using the robotic arm, while using his own arm to scratch its head. So somehow, in the course of a few days, the monkey unlearned how to connect the brain activity to the biological arm, rewire a new part of the brain, and still keep the controlling part of the robotic arm. So he gets essentially a third arm. He has the 2 biological arms that he had and a third one that he controls. Now this stays for a few hours before it decays, but it shows where we can go. It shows that we can actually have the brain learn somehow how to reallocate resources when it's able to do that, and control things on the outside world. And once we start putting chips, digital chips, in people's brains, and actually having them control things in the outside world, we can not just control basic things that we had, we can actually change and enhance our capabilities. So if I have a digital chip in my brain, and you have one in your brain, we can't just control things, we can actually communicate. So instead of me using my own language to speak to you, I can just directly communicate my thoughts to you. Essentially, deliver information without using this slow process of thinking about verbs and adjectives and using vibrations in the air to speak to you, just directly going to you. And this is becoming very efficient. So if you think about language, with our mouth, we speak at about a rate of 150 words per minute. But we can think thoughts at about 600 thoughts per minute. So we can think much faster than we can speak. Actually, language slows us down. Even me, when I speak a little bit faster, the language is still very, very much slow down. Even me, when I'm excited, right now, it's still much slower. So I can think a lot faster than I communicate to you, which means that I'm wasting a lot of time. Instead of 30 minutes, I can just think for a second, just broadcast to your brains, and you just got it, and you get, more times with Rosé. But somehow, we chose, because of the mechanism that we have, to speak in this process, which means that we're slowed down by our own machinery. And once we overcome this, we can actually start communicating faster and using the resources in a better way. We don't really know if when I think a thought, put it in words, communicate it to you, and you put it into your own mind, you actually see what I see. The more connected our brains can be, the easier it is to actually know that what I say is what you think. Now, if we get to the point where we put a chip in someone's brain, it doesn't just have to be something that we use for communication. We can use it for everything. Anything that chips, digital machines, know how to do, we can have the brain do. So if we think about chess, for example, we know that computers are much better than humans in playing chess right now. But if I asked you to look at this board and tell me what is the best move for the black, you can all spend some time looking at it. Some of you might be accurate, some of you might not be, but it will take you a lot longer than a computer will just solve this right away. If you had a phone, you can type this board into the phone and it will solve it faster, which means that you can actually have a device right now that solves a puzzle. It's just not in your brain. But if we take a digital chip and put it in our brain, and we just move the thought into the chip, it would actually solve it right away. And the magic is the same magic of the wings, which is it won't feel to us like something happening outside. Right, when I ask you right now to tell me how much is 2 plus 3, you don't say, you know what, let me think about it. I'm going to outsource this process to the prefrontal cortex. It's going to solve it for me and give it back to me, and I'm going to tell you it's 5. It just feels like our brain does the processing. So once we plug stuff into the brain, it would be the same. Our brain will immediately assume that everything that connects to it is one part that we call me, and all that thinking about solving chess problems will just be part of my thinking. It won't feel anymore like we're outsourcing it to a machine. It would be like we're doing it ourselves. So we spoke about communication. We spoke about solving problems. We can actually solve problems that are even more complex than ones that involve logic. We can actually solve problems that do with feelings and emotions. So from our point of view, there's a very big difference between thinking and feeling. But from the brain's point of view, there is no difference. It's just different parts of the brain that do this processing. It's all processing. We labeled some processing as feeling and some as thinking based on how much control we have over them. But for the brain, it's just different things. So once we can have a digital machine in our brain control things in our brain, we can actually also outsource our feeling. And we know that our feelings are actually biased, and they make us do things that we might not want. So many of you probably in the last couple of years did things that you felt you should do, but then regretted them. In the last year, 2016, there are more people who died from extreme selfies than from shark attacks, which means that humans make things that are not good for them, and even though we know that they're not good for us, we still do them, which means that our feeling actually isn't a great process for our survival. Once we can have something in our brain that actually vetoes thoughts that are not great, we would still feel that we don't want to do that, but it would now be a smarter version of us making the choices. And once you go there, into smarter version of you inside your brain, you can really think of all the things that your brain is not good at and having something veto them. So it could go into voting. We know that in the world, a lot of people are voting in an uninformed way or even against their interests. Now, if you have something in your brain that actually equates things properly and weighs things correctly, you might actually vote better. book recommendations. Instead of just choosing randomly by Amazon, you can actually have it in your brain and you make the choice based on what you think is best for you. All of those machineries are in our brain and they can actually now work for you in the same way. You would think that you just want to read this book and you wouldn't really know the separation between what was internally biologically and what is something that comes with information that is bigger than yours. And it goes into biases. We know that there are a lot of biases that people have that we can easily analytically realize are not good for us, and now we can solve for them. We know that people aren't really good in assessing a lot of their states. So people drive when they're fatigued, and they really think that they can do that, but now we can have something in your brain tell you, just go to sleep. All of those moments that our brain is failing at can now be remedied by something that is smarter than us, that helps us because it knows what we want. And in a way, what's smart about that is that it actually makes us think now about the brain as a processing unit rather than as us. And this is a big gap that we have to go because we tend to favor our own brain. We immediately think that everything we think is what we want. And in fact, when one of my students every now and then fails to remember that this is not how we think, that the brain just processes stuff and that what we want is a different process, not the entirety, we actually make them wear a t-shirt now that we made that says, don't believe everything you think. We tend to do that. We tend to just think that if we thought it, we must have wanted it. But now we know that there's a gap in the brain and that this gap might not necessarily is the complete version of you. And more than that, we know that the complete version of you is limited by your thoughts. As in, whatever you can think is what you think reality is. But we know reality is much wider. So here's an example. This is a colleague of mine, he's a professor in Germany. His name is Bertolt Meyer, and he was born without his left hand. Now, he's an engineer, so he actually built his own prosthetic. He has a prosthetic hand that he can use to control and move and navigate the world. But because his hand was built by engineers, it can do things that your hands cannot do, like it can rotate 360 degrees, which means that he can think thoughts that you cannot think. His brain is capable of thinking more things that you can, so he can actually think about putting a light bulb in one movement. Right? You can't even think this thought until I said it right now. Now, when you see him, you can actually realize that there's more thoughts out there about things you can do that aren't in your capacity. And now, when we expand the machinery of our body, we can think more of those thoughts. We can actually create a stronger language for things that right now don't exist in our language. And when we think about that, we can actually think about the most extreme version of what we can do with the body when it comes to what we can change, which is change entirely the body. This is the extreme version of that. In a way, when we talk about ourselves, we think of ourselves as this entirety. But essentially, for the most part, it's our brain that speaks. So if you lost your pinky, or if you had an accident that made you change somehow your body, you will still feel like you're yourself. Only when we change our brain, we start to feel that we're not ourselves. That's a thing that, as we start replacing things, becomes more and more reality. We know that, for instance, the brain remains the same even though your body changes entirely in the course of your lifetime. So if you learn how to ride bicycles when you're 6 years old, your body was much smaller than it is when you're right now a big person. But over the course of your lifetime, your body got bigger, and your brain adapted and learned somehow how to still ride the bicycle using a different body. It learned how to change the signals and send information to the legs much longer time course. We actually know that the brain always calculates how long the body is and controls how to do things. We actually know that it needs to spend time thinking how fast to send signals to each leg so you would move them in the same time. We know that it actually has a version of your body that sits there and changes all the time. That's why we actually know now that the taller you are, it takes more time for information to go from your feet to your brain. So that's why tall people live in the past more than short people, because it takes more for them to calculate things. And the idea here is that the body changed over your lifetime, but your brain remained the same. And we can now help this by changing more and more things in your body. Maybe you can be born in one shape, but as you get older, you start replacing parts, and you say, I don't want to stay a white woman. I want to change into an Asian man. And you can start replacing that. As long as we know how to change the plastic surgery of the outside, and the brain is the same, and we know how to connect to it, we can really go into the world of science fiction, which is changing everything about your body in your lifetime. And when I spoke about that to plastic surgeons, the sentence they gave me that really made me think about it and understand how they think about it is something that they equated to laptops. They said you would never buy a laptop if someone told you have to use the same laptop for 80 years. But this is how we treat the body. We're basically saying the body I'm born with is what I'm going to have for the next 80 years. I'm not going to change anything. Whatever I came with is what I'm going to have. And now we realize that we can change more and more things. And with that, as long as the brain remains the same, we can actually maintain our identity while changing everything. When I was a kid, there was a TV series, an American TV series called The $6 Million Man, about a guy who basically had an accident and everything about his body was replaced. And he became stronger, he ran faster, he could jump higher, and he was kind of solving puzzles. In a way, this TV series that was in the science fiction section when I was a kid is now gradually moving into documentary, and the only thing that's science fiction about it is the price. It's now much, much more expensive than $6 million to replace body parts. And what is amazing about that is that once we start replacing things, we don't have to just stick to the things that nature gave us. We can actually take things from the outside and connect them to our body and extend our reality. So if you think about vision for a second, one of the senses that we're best at, right? We are really, really visual entity. We can see everything in between the infrared to the ultraviolet spectrum, and we think this is the world. We think that what we see is what's out there, but we all know that there's more things out there that we don't see. Right now, for many of you, you have mobile phones, and they have rays of connections that go from your phones to a cell tower somewhere. You don't see that. It's here, but it's not in your reality. But if there was a bat in the room, the bat would actually fly between those rays, because those rays are part of the bat's reality. And what we know is that if we look at all the rays out there, what we see is only 1/10 trillionth of the things out there. There's X-rays and gamma rays and radio waves, and all of those things exist in the reality. It's just that our perceptual reality doesn't see them, so we can't really experience all of the things out there. But we know that they exist because we can sense them. And once we know that they exist, we know that we can actually sense them, plug into the brain, and actually have the brain learn how to see them. And it's not science fiction anymore, because, for instance, in the last 5 years, there's a spike in people who were born deaf. So they never heard anything in their life. Their entire auditory cortex doesn't hear anything, but we build cochlear implants, devices that actually take vibrations in the air and plug them to the brain using the brain's language. And after a few months of training, those people actually learn to get a pretty accurate sense of hearing. So their brain uses the same machinery that we know how to build and the language that it knows how to speak to do its work, connect to it, and actually give people that are deaf the ability to hear. And if we know that the brain can do that, we don't have to limit ourselves to the machinery that exists in the body, like the nose, the ears, and the eyes, or the taste, or the skin. We can actually take things from nature and plug them into the brain and get more things. So we know that animals out there have a lot more machineries that we don't really have. So birds have in their brain a little thing that aligns their flying with the magnetic field of Earth, so they fly always in the same orientations. We know that bats have these echolocating sonars that basically tell them how far they are from all kinds of obstacles. They have this machinery that knows what reality is, and it speaks to their brain in its language. We know that there's snakes who have heat beats. They actually see the world in infrared, and they can just see what's hot or cold out there. And we know that the male moth, the little moth, actually can sense using its smell a female moth out of 10 to the 17,000 molecules out there. So if there's a female moth somewhere in Paris right now, a male moth would know about it. And it could find her, like undergrads, right? They have the same thing. So the idea is that all of those things are machinery that nature created. And at the end, they speak to our brain, which is exactly like ours. So if we just plug them into our brain and let the brain do its thing, it will presumably learn how to speak to them, and we're going to enhance our senses. We'll see farther, we'll smell better, we'll hear better, and so on. And this means we can actually start creating humans that have far better talents than the ones we were born with. So maybe we take the heat beats from the snake and we create TSA agents that just see infrared. Instead of having to go to security and go to this like machine, someone just looks at you and says, yeah, you're good, you can go away, right? Because his eyes are going to have this machinery. Or maybe if we're working in moving, we can just replace your biological arm with a stronger one that just allows you to lift pianos with one hand, because the brain would think the same thoughts, but they just have stronger lift. Or if you want to go into connecting everything to the brain, you can maybe drive your car and connect your gas tank to your stomach. So when you're getting empty, you're going to actually feel hungry and you know that you need to get fuel. Or I know many people here are in finance. You can actually plug your stock portfolio to your pain and pleasure levels. So when your stocks go up, you're going to feel pain, and when you pleasure. And if it goes down, you're going to still kind of feeling pain in the back, and you know that something is wrong with your portfolio. Or if you're not really good in reading people's cues, you can actually go on a date and have a machine in your face read the facial expression of the other person in a date and tell you you're doing well or doing poorly. So somehow use all the mechanics that we have right now to give us readings about the brain. And here is the magic thing that is cool about that. The idea that we can plug stuff to the brain basically suggests that we lived in the cave up to now. So everyone who read philosophy knows about Plato's cave and the idea that we go outside of the cave and we see reality the way it is. But what we learned in the last 2 years is that the cave actually is in our head. We all live in this virtual reality where we see stuff that we can see with our senses, and we call this reality. But reality is much, much wider, much richer. There's a lot more out there. So the cave actually walks with us all the time. And to escape the cave, we actually have to understand something profound, which is that what our brain is able to do is not what we're limited by, but a lot more. And with that in mind, what you have to understand is that this is not science fiction. Everything I spoke about up to now, everything I mentioned is something that either was already tried, tested, or in clinical trials, or being published. So all of those things that we think are science fiction actually are being done. We can replace brain parts. Now people with Alzheimer can actually get a chip in their brain that reads how their brain works before they have a decay, and then when they have a decay, we can actually just put a chip and actually help them retrieve some of their memories. We can now download memories to the extent that we can actually keep extent of your memories outside your brain and retrieve them and make you do better in remembering things after we learn how your memory works. We have one study that came a few years ago, 3 years ago, that showed that you can take two mice and have their brain read a decision to move left or right, communicate it to the other side of the world, and have them basically speak without any communication, and so on. We can cure blindness, we can cure deafness, and we can essentially do all of those things that seem like science fiction to many of you in the first 20 minutes, but actually look at them as reality. One of the things that I am baffled by in the last couple of years is how VR changes our brain in those contexts. So 2 days ago, I was playing with the idea of putting a VR goggle and sitting on the top of a big building and being asked to make the step to fall down. And my body and my brain felt fear. I was sitting above, I knew it's virtual reality, and I knew that I can easily walk outside, but I felt this fear. I actually overcame this fear, and I did make the step, and I was floating in the air. Now, in reality, every person in history who tried that just fell, and their ancestry was ended. So they never got to actually, teach their sons and daughters how to live in a world that flies. But once we can actually have virtual reality teach you how to rewire your brain because you're going to experience things and not die from them, we can actually train the brain so that we can pass all kinds of things that we never were able to train ourselves before. So we can actually change our brain by creating realities that tweak the way it works. Now, all of those together, those studies, what virtual reality enables us to do, is magical, but to me there is one thing that is the epicenter of the magic, and that's the idea of curing blindness. Curing blindness to me is magical not because it's any different than curing deafness or actually making people with a sense of smell that's not great get better. It is because it ties to something that for humans is the essence of our belief in the afterlife and what's behind it. And here's what I mean by that. When I saw that the study that showed that you can actually take people that are blind and replace the retina and actually feed the retina with sensors that are CCD sensors that can get photodirection and actually communicate to the brain, I was reminded of the last person that cured the blind and gave sight to the blind, and we declared this person God 2,000 years ago. So in many ways, what we're playing with right now is what not long ago we used to think is being God. Anything that has to do with cheating death, with replacing parts, with giving us something that we didn't have, was what we perceived not long ago as something that is the difference between being human and being a god. And what we're playing with right now is exactly that. We are in control of nature. Now, some people ask me when I talk about that, is it real in the sense that, fine, we know that science can do that, but is it going to be in our life? Like, who is actually going to be the one to put a chip in their brain? So it turns out that right now there's about 120,000 people that already have a chip in their brain. And those are patients that have all kinds of problems that required surgery to work the chip inside. Those are the ones that I worked with mostly to study how we can plug stuff in the brain. And we now already have people in clinical trials that ask to do that for not just clinical purposes, but also for purposes that are beyond just the problem they have. And in many ways, what stops us is the psychology of our reality. We think of the body still as a sacred thing. Whatever we're born with is us. We don't want to toy with that. But if you think about it, if you go back to the 1960s, for instance, we had the same idea that the body is sacred and whatever we're born with is what we are and we don't want to change anything. And over the course of 60 years, we gradually started to understand that we can change things and it's not the end of the world. Now, in the US, 1 out of 4 girls aged 16 asks for breast implants for her birthday. And we don't think about it as a big change. Now it's acceptable. And I think the same thing is going to happen to putting stuff in our brain. We're going to first see one person doing that and having an advantage. It's going to seem better, and then gradually it's going to happen. Here's a scenario that I can imagine. One Silicon Valley entrepreneur just goes and does it. He puts a chip in his brain for thinking faster, and he maybe does high-frequency trading faster than all his friends, and he does better. And then everyone else is going to start putting it in their brain, and before long, it's going to be something that everyone wants to put in their brain. It's going to be the thing that everyone would like. And when I thought about this scenario that seems not too science fiction-y, people can do that, it occurred to me that this is exactly how evolution works. It starts with a mutation that one person has that is somehow better. It gives him or her an advantage, and then everyone else wants the same thing, and they kind of pick the same advantage, and it quickly spreads, and before long, we now have everyone having this mutation in life. Only the difference between what we think of evolution and what we have right now is that evolution works supposedly with one mechanic that is just natural and random, and here we will actually have an intelligent design. An intelligent designer is going to be us. We're going to create it ourselves and let the world spread it the way we want. What's difficult for us to grasp, and what makes it a gap between what we have right now and what we're going to have soon, is our perception of identity. We think that we are unique, we think that we have consciousness, we think that we are very, very special, and any change in the brain is going to tinker with the soul, or the thing that makes us who we are. And that's why scientists like myself spend a lot of time right now looking at exactly that. What is consciousness? What is the thing that makes us who we are? And the more we look, it seems to not exist. It seems that everywhere we look, we can take this part out, and you still are who you are. There's no one thing that if you take it out, you're no longer yourself. And this makes scientists like myself actually come up with an analogy that I like to end with, which is that maybe consciousness isn't a single thing, it's just the emergent property of all of them together. The way to understand it came to me a few weeks ago when I was driving in Chicago, and I was stuck in traffic. And I spoke to a friend of mine on the phone, and I was complaining. I said, I'm stuck in traffic. And he said, you're not stuck in traffic, you are traffic. And in that sense, this maybe is what consciousness is. No single car is traffic. It's only that when all of them are together that there's this thing that we call traffic. Maybe consciousness is just that, the sum of all of the components. And if that's the case, then once we start putting more things in the brain, we just expand our consciousness, and we're no longer going to be different people. We're just going to be us with a better brain. And it's so difficult for us to accept that it made me think of an analogy that will help you see where we're going with that. So 400 years ago, Galileo Galilei put his telescope into Jupiter, and he was looking at the moons of Jupiter, which he thought would orbit the planet in a certain direction, but it wasn't working. The orbits were not aligned. And the only way for him to actually align the equations was to change the solar system and actually move Earth from being the center to being the third planet and put the sun in the center. Now, this to him felt like a dethronement of humankind. What does it mean that we're not the main thing in the universe, that we're just one planet out of many? But once he accepted it, once he actually changed the solar system, it allowed us in the last 400 years to actually explore the wide reaches of the universe and see far beyond what everyone imagined the world is. In the same way, in the last 2 years, and in the next decade, I believe, we're going to do the same thing to the world. We're going to realize that in our own little universe, we're not the center. We're just one more entity out of many that actually vie for dominance and competes, and maybe not the smartest one, not the best one. And as we understand that we're not the center, and we're going to change the solar system of our own little brain, we're going to begin to understand the most interesting thing in the universe, which is us. Thank you.